From 2007 to 2008, I worked on a heartbreaking case involving children abduction. What I discovered made me retire. This is not how I intended to retire from the force. Do you know that feeling? When you did everything right except for the very last thing, and then it leaves that indelible stain on something that could have been impeccable? This is exactly how I feel, even after all these years. But if there is a greater sentiment in my heart, then it is certainly my gratitude for being alive to tell you this story. Sylvie is the name, or Sylv, like my former colleagues still call me to this day. I have been in the police from 1985 to 2008, went from dispatch officer to detective in 1991, and remained one until my forced retirement. I was never interested in climbing up the ranks. Instead, I wanted to be where I could bring the maximum value. I believed it to be investigations, and was recognized for being good at solving missing persons cases. After 21 years of service, I started to feel a little old and rusty and wanted to shift my attention on another passion of mine: baking. I think I should have listened to that feeling. Why did not I listen? Because every time I was very close to do so, there was a case that needed to be solved, and I could not just let it go. I had to help the persons and the families involved. The Firefly cases then started in 2007. A string of disappearances so puzzling, inexplicable, and frustrating that I started experiencing hair loss the more I investigated. It was always the same modus operandi. A child is out for whatever reason, at least most of the time, sees a light, apparently a firefly, follows it to a very quiet area with no prying eyes, and just vanishes. Whoever sick psycho that was doing it had to be aware of the cameras all throughout the city, because the vanishing part always occurred in a dead angle that the device could not cover. Be it for taunting or another reason, there was always one item belonging to the victim left on the scene. If only we could get all the right answers. The first case brought to our table was that of little Marjorie. The 8-year-old girl was last seen walking home from school, since the two locations were less than 800 meters apart. On a camera mounted to a street pole, something resembling a firefly can be seen emerging from a small bush, gained the attention of the little girl by flying around and way above her in circles, and then led her to an adjacent, quieter alley with no cameras. The only thing she left behind was her right shoe. Another case, not the second, was that of little Spencer, out with his parents at a restaurant. We do not know how or when he noticed the firefly, but at some point, the 11-year-old can be seen following it to the toilets of the establishment, and he was never found to this day. He left his baseball cap behind. The most frightening case was that of little Harrison. No child is safe anywhere anymore. The 8-year-old boy lived with his parents in their CCTV monitored house in an upscale neighborhood. The firefly can be seen gaining the attention of the boy late at night, and through his window by bumping into it. The boy then pushed the curtain aside, curious about the noise, then opened the window, curious about the light, and let it in. He was never seen again, and left only one button of his pajamas behind. The more we approached 2008, the more the responsibles struggled to contain themselves, and the cases became terrifyingly frequent. We started a whole campaign advising parents and kids themselves as well to avoid following fireflies or anything that resembles little light. We also had officers constantly patrolling areas to ensure maximum safety. It worked with the parents as they became stricter, but not really with the children as the disappearances continued. The most disturbing and mind-bending case came afterwards. 3 kids were last seen playing in a park near their neighboring houses. On one of the cameras in the park, for the first time, we could see the arrival of the light on the scene. Its flight was very precise and intentional, like a small drone. It was not flashing or flickering, and it entered one of the attraction for children that was a fairy little house. It stayed there until the children were close enough, then revealed itself, flying and flashing like a firefly. You could see the kids struggling in their minds about making the right decision. but I guess the promise of a magical adventure is far too tempting for our little ones. Probably placing their confidence in their number, the 3 children followed the little light in the house. It had little windows that allowed us investigators to have a glimpse of what occurred inside. The light seemingly grew brighter after a few seconds, and my heart sank when I saw the house shaking as if they put an actual fight for their lives. When they realized that it was a trap, then everything stopped. That was it. 3 kids at once. 6-year-old Betty, 7-year-old Maria, and 9-year-old Jennifer, leaving behind a bracelet, an earring, and a butterfly-shaped hairpin, respectively. Rage and uproar overcame the town. We had vigilante groups forming and people accusing others of being the culprits and being involved in human trafficking and terrorism. We had countless calls pouring in every single day that of course did not lead anywhere. I was put under more pressure than anyone else in the service because of the record that I had for solving missing persons cases, and it seemed that the entire burden of the Firefly mystery rested on my shoulders. Several theories involving the supernatural emerged, but I was not one to entertain such crap. It had to be one or several persons using some very elaborate things. We just had to bring all the right pieces together. So of course, I did some digging and learned that the same thing was happening in a few other towns as well, but the cases were seemingly swept under the carpet to avoid a rather justified national hysteria. Children were disappearing. I always told myself that as a woman, a mother, and a human being, I was ready to shine maximum light on those cases to raise awareness. I tried contacting the colleagues who worked on the cases in other towns, but received puzzling responses from them. Honestly, it was as if they did not care or they were instructed not to say much. Enraged by their reactions to the cases, I investigated them, convinced that they all could be involved and that they could lead me to answers. I discovered something. Most, if not all, of those colleagues were approached by shady people who somehow managed to dissuade them from pursuing investigations and just put everything on hush. Meanwhile, the bastards grew more confident, taking children away, and if it was not happening in our town, it was happening elsewhere. My husband Albert and I grew so paranoid that we put bars on every window and door, and they were usually closed at all times, just to protect our 2 boys. We were scared of all kinds of lights, especially if it was small and very bright. Soon enough, the shady people approached my colleagues, and me in particular, each of us in our own respective homes. No, they were not dressed in black suites with sunglasses and all that, but I could still read government written all over them. My husband told it to me later, but while 2 of them were trying to coerce me to let them contain the threat, as they called it, themselves, a 3rd agent was standing behind the 2 others, arms crossed, staring at him, with one of her fingers twitching. It was a secret message in Morse code. Being a former Boy Scout, getting the message was a piece of cake for my husband, though it was very unclear at first. Watch till I sex it. Until I see what? And watch out for what exactly? My husband thought. Was he supposed to pick up anything subtle while they were in our house? Everything started to become too dangerous, and Albert was even thinking about relocating in another continent, just to be on the safe side. Literal threats in our home? Government involvement? Psychos abducting kids and watch till you see it? Should we just keep an eye open on the cases until we see something? So many questions, so many stress. My health and our life quality were declining. One day, I decided to watch one of the surveillance tapes, and this is when it hit me. The message was for me, and all the other investigators at least, those who decided to ignore the threats. Honestly, what was there to watch other than the tapes? So I re-watched them, again and again, without finding a single clue. I did not let the frustration get to me. Maybe the agent meant watching entire tapes, instead of the shorter versions we got from the investigations, which could be several days long depending on the capacity of the surveillance equipment used. I decided to give it a shot. Most of the recordings were erased by the different maintenance crews because they considered that we already got what we needed. However, miracles happen, and for the cases I mentioned earlier, the full tapes, if I can call them as such, were still available. It took time, it took long, but we discovered something even stranger. On the scene of each disappearance, after many hours and even days in some cases, an animal would emerge without it first arriving there prior to the events. The same way it did not make sense for those kids to disappear at those places, it did not make sense for those animals to appear there. In the case of little Marjorie, a rabbit was seen emerging from the alley hours later at night and leaving the scene. For little Spencer, they kept the recordings because something extraordinary happened, but they never thought it could be useful for the investigations, so they never brought it up. A snake, a freaking snake, could be seen emerging from the restroom area after about 2 days, and during the night when the restaurant is closed, and just disappear out of view at a dead angle. The employees said that they never encountered it in the facility or even outside, but they cannot really tell how it got in or out. For little Harrison, as his distraught mother kept hope, leaving the door and the windows of his room open. Day in and day out, a light could be seen from a window after a few days, glowing out of the blue at 01:46 a.m. and for about 4 seconds. Afterwards, a blackbird, probably a raven, just flew out from the same window. She never brought it up to us, in fact. She never checked, never knew, and just kept waiting. She still is. For little Betty, Maria, and Jennifer, a husky dog emerged from the ferry house after a strange light shone inside, hours after the girls had vanished. I still remember its piercing eyes as it looked directly at the camera. It felt like looking into my soul. It was disturbing. The colleagues started again with the supernatural crap, with the outlandish theory that the light was turning the children into animals. Give me a break, come on! Are you kidding me? It was rather quickly debunked, because in the case of the 3 little girls, Betty, Maria, and Jennifer, only one animal emerged, 1 instead of 3. It hurt me to think that, but I wanted to be on the scene of the next one. I knew it meant one more child disappearing, but I had to investigate and find some much-needed answers. It happened on November the 23rd, 2008. This is certainly the day I knew that it was it for me. I had to retire and let it go somehow. I am still very ashamed, but I had to. A distressed father called the emergency number in absolute panic, saying that a thing was trying to take his daughter from him and both were hiding somewhere in an abandoned factory. By the time we got there, it was too late. Apparently, both of them were living there because the father was paid to guard the premises. We found him with the entire left side of his torso bitten off and missing. The coroner said he could not believe his eyes because the bite marks resembled that of an animal that is no longer around in our era, and saying its name would label him as crazy and send him to an asylum and an early retirement. We traced the little footsteps of Heather, the 7-year-old little girl, through the snow and to the back of the factory where they abruptly stopped. The government guys also showed up, taking charge immediately before the arrival of the press and reinforcing my will to uncover the truth. They threatened and almost chased everyone away at some point. But the most revolting thing, according to me, was that for people claiming to have the intention of containing the threat, they did not do much. I strongly believe that they knew about the animals appearing after the disappearances, yet they only set up a few strange devices all around the place and just left. I was not going to miss them anyway. Whatever trick or technology that was helping the culprits abduct those kids, I was going to discover it. What if it was actually the work of those government guys, I thought, at some point. After all, for people with considerable means, they did not seem to try hard enough to put an end to the nightmare. Therefore, I was going to do just that. I tried to convince my colleagues to go back on the scene and wait, as we initially planned. But the government people suddenly became a big enough reason for them to change their minds. I went back alone. I parked my car at an angle where I could have full view of the back of the factory and waited. I waited long hours, from 1 p.m. to 10 p.m., fighting hunger, tiredness, and sleep, just waiting to see what would emerge. I hoped that the government guy's strange devices would not jeopardize my plan somehow, and was finally rewarded at exactly 10:17 p.m. A faint yellow light glowed all of a sudden near the back entrance and behind a box for no more than 5 seconds. I wanted to inspect it at close range, so I got out of my car, and as a result, could not see when the light stopped. One of the government people devices located nearby started acting strangely, emitting loud beeping sounds, and I did not want it to spoil everything, so I kicking it down to turn it off and damaged it. I carefully approached the area, occasionally looking around just in case, and as expected. Right where the light shone just moments ago, I saw the blackest cat I have ever seen and will ever see in my life sitting there, with its back on me. I froze, watching its peculiar behavior. It was stretching, but not like the animal it was, rather like the way humans roll their heads around to make their necks crack. As soon as it sensed me, it also froze and slowly turned its head to look at me standing there, a few meters away, revealing its glowing eyes. That cat did not have a shred of fear of me. Still looking at me, it then slowly turned its entire body to face me, then standing on all fours before making its way towards a broken window. I know it may sound ridiculous, but its behavior seemed to speak to me in a rather confident and condescending way, such as, "Looks like you finally found me." Well, I accept the challenge. Let's settle this now. Follow me. That was how I felt it. That was how it looked like to me. The cat leaped and landed on the window frame, looked back at me one last time before going inside the factory. The moment it disappeared behind the wall, the yellow light appeared inside for about 2 seconds, then vanished, confirming that the animal was indeed its source. I gathered the immense courage to follow that cat into the dark and the unknown of the abandoned factory, using the same window, and landed on a machine, then on the floor. Flashlight and gun out. I braced myself and started advancing, ready to confront the culprits and put an end to the nightmare. Countless machines that I did not really recognize revealed themselves under the flashlight, placed in rows, and most of them covered with old, discolored, and dusty sheets. My heartbeat quickening, I scanned the surroundings carefully until I spotted something out of the ordinary. Seated on one of the machines and watching me was a spider. A large spider so massive that it seemed to have difficulties to move fast enough as it hid behind the covered machine. I kept calm and courage after gasping and still advanced carefully. A yellow light shone from behind the machine, shortly just like before, then vanished. I gasped again and almost spoke to it when a husky dog, just like in the video footage involving the 3 little girls, Betty, Maria, and Jennifer, emerged from behind the machine. It had the same behavior and confidence as the cat, staring at my soul as it sauntered towards the next machine and disappeared behind it. The yellow light shortly returned again, and on the other side, a deer emerged, still staring at me, walking towards the next machine. It repeated the process, hiding behind the machine, yellow light for a short time, until a new animal emerged from the other side. That time, it was the snake from the Spencer video footage. The reptile hid behind another machine, and the yellow light shortly appeared again. But this time, the animal remained hidden, waiting for me to uncover it. By that time, I was shaking uncontrollably, dominated by fear. I considered running away, while I still could, because I had no idea what was going on and what I was up against. But the children, I had to do it for the children and their families. Trembling, I made my way towards the machine, breathing so heavily that I knew the animal could hear me and sense every bit of my fear. I put the flashlight between my teeth to free my left hand and extended it to remove the sheet. The moment I pulled it off the machine, a bird escaped from behind it and flew past me, right above my head. I could not help but scream this time. I then picked up the flashlight and tried to keep the bird under the light, but it was very fast and made its way through an open entrance, turning right and disappearing in a corridor. Once again, yellow light shortly, followed by massive stomping sounds, and through the entrance I saw an elephant running from the right to the left. I was shocked, paralyzed, and afraid. Once more yellow light shortly, and for the first time the animal made a sound with its mouth. It was a roar, announcing its terrifying new form as one of those big cats, a lion or a tiger maybe, or perhaps something much worse. I could not continue. I dashed towards the window, hoping that whatever that was would not give chase, and climbed on the machine next to the opening. I looked back at the corridor entrance and saw nothing but an eye shining in the dark, staring at me. It was big enough for me to see that it was a left eye, precisely a left yellow pupil. I still remember the exact and only word that escaped from my mouth. Why? I know it does not make any sense, but I want you to picture this. When you see that somebody despises you can see it on their face. The frowning, the death stare, the way the lips curve downward. A group of elements forming the face that serves to reflect the sentiment of that person towards you. Now, imagine hatred, disgust, and evil intent, all conveyed through only an eye. One single eye. This is why I asked myself, why? Why do you hate me so much? Why do you want to rip me apart? What history do we have that led to such extremes? The monster did not move. Fortunately, I did not intend to clearly see what form it took this time, as I hurt my ankle, storming through the window to escape it. Still on the ground, using my gun covered with some snow, I turned around and aimed at the window because I expected the animal to appear at the frame. It did not. I then stood up and limped to my car, only to see the black cat standing on the roof of the vehicle, waiting for me, staring at me with the same glowing yellow left eye, the same yellow pupil. Its extreme hatred, multiplied by the visibility of its entire head. I abandoned the vehicle. Gun in hand, I limped for hours, constantly looking around me to see if the animal was pursuing me, bewildering the occasional motorists who saw me fleeing. Never in my life have I been so afraid, and to this day, nothing and nobody ever scared me in the way that thing did, whatever it is. However, this is only the part I remember. Some colleagues told me that I was found under a bridge, acting erratically, repeating to myself how much of a piece of shit I was, and that the sunset was close, whatever it meant. I retired a few days later. Who could believe that I would one day tell stories of the supernatural? The only thing I can say is that certain things out there are beyond any form of explanations. I failed to solve the cases and retired. The agents came to our house again to threaten us in a much more convincing way, and this time, we listened to them. At least, they have been kind enough not to ask me to pay for the device I had damaged, which of course cost millions. My family and I moved far away from that place and all the way to another continent, as initially suggested by my husband. I am even more grateful for the well-being and safety of my children. I do not know what that thing is, and I do not care to know. I am still scared of animals to this day, and could never step into a zoo, a forest, or a park since. Every time an animal looks at me, I freeze completely. I do not know why those government guys want to keep things secret, or even if that thing is still snatching kids, but I will never say this enough. Please be careful. Some strange beings live among us, and sometimes things are not as they seem. I regret participating in a deja vu study. I don't really want to get into why, but I lost my job and needed some quick cash. I've done various research studies and medical trials for cash before, so I thought it would be an easy way to get something to help hold me off until I could find another gig. I came across an ad for a medical study that paid surprisingly well, so I signed up without thinking too much of it. The building was huge, and I got turned around. The long, identical white hallways all meshed together as a one in my head as I tried to find room 312. I arrived late, but the staff was kind and understanding. I was told that this study was on déjà vu, and that full participation in this study required the insertion of a microchip into the brain. Look, I really didn't want a chip implanted in my head, but this study paid really well, and I needed the money. They told me that déjà vu was like a glitch in a particular area of the brain, which they had been able to isolate. Upon insertion, the chip would cause a constant, minor stress to that area of the brain, making déjà vu more likely to occur. All I had to do was record the details of what happened leading up to an episode of déjà vu that I experienced. That way, they could identify patterns and specific triggers, which they could then use to trigger an episode of déjà vu on me inside the lab. There, they could record and monitor the episode for their research. I signed the consent forms, and the procedure was done right then and there. It was a bit nerve-wracking to be awake while something went into my skull, but overall it was relatively quick and painless. I did, however, experience a dull ache at the insertion site afterwards, which was one of the side effects they had listed. The other possible side effects included nausea and insomnia, as well as phantom odors, minor confusion, and increased heart rate during an episode. So I expected to have some side effects. I expected to have some minor confusion, but what I have experienced since then has gone so far beyond that I no longer know what to do. I'll start with my first episode, which was so tame in comparison to the others, but at the time really unsettled me. It was about a week after the insertion. I made my morning coffee the same way I do every single morning. I started up a pot of coffee, took the cream out of the fridge, and grabbed a mug, all while the coffee was brewing. The coffee finished brewing, so I picked up the pot and began to pour the coffee into my cup. That's when I felt it. It came on like a rush, as if I had just ridden a wave backwards in time, and was reliving a recording of the moment that had passed only seconds ago. I know I pour my coffee this same exact way every morning, but this was different. I hadn't just poured my coffee like this before. I had lived this very moment. The rush wore off, and I was left in a kind of a daze, unlike any time I had experienced déjà vu in the past. My vision was fuzzy, and I was on autopilot as I poured the last bit of coffee into my mug. I picked up the mug and took a sip. It wasn't coffee. The unfamiliar taste caused me to snap out of my daze. My mug was filled with pure cream. Puzzled, I stared at it for some time as I tried to figure out what on earth had just happened. I know I wasn't paying full attention, but I so vividly remembered picking up the pot of coffee and pouring it into my mug. But when I looked back, the coffee pot was full and untouched. The cap to the cream sat on the counter, and the container of cream was half empty. They said minor confusion was a side effect that went along with an episode of déjà vu, but I started to pour my coffee before the déjà vu set in, so it just didn't make sense. It was unsettling, but I eventually accepted it, attempted to transfer the cream from my mug back into the container, and poured an actual cup of coffee. I convinced myself that it wasn't that big of a deal, which is something I now regret. The second time I felt déjà vu was 3 days later. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth, nothing out of the ordinary. It was as it always was when I brushed my teeth before bed. I didn't really think too much about what I was doing. My mind was wandering here and there in a few different directions, never fully focused on the actual act of brushing my teeth, but I was still conscious and aware. Of course, I have brushed my teeth in this same spot before, but when the rush of déjà vu hit me, I was certain that I had rewound time and was now reliving this same exact experience of brushing my teeth. The way I looked at myself in the mirror, the exact movements of the bristles sweeping across my teeth side to side, up and down. The rush faded as I continued to brush, but my mouth tasted absolutely foul. Bitter. It burned. It burned so badly and I couldn't breathe. I stood over my kitchen sink, my heart beating violently as I desperately gasped for air, simultaneously spitting out a gritty white foamy substance out of my mouth. I spat and spat, but it was still there. I released the death grip I hadn't even realized I had on my toothbrush and frantically reached for the faucet. I yanked the water on and shoved my head underneath, the water splashing both inside my mouth and all over my face. A powdery substance remained stuck to the insides of my molars, and I swished the water around aggressively in my mouth in an attempt to get rid of it fully. After several minutes of rinsing and swishing, I turned off the faucet and paused. Everything was quiet, aside from the occasional ping of the water dripping off of my face and into the metal sink. My mouth burned, and the foul taste lingered, but I was okay. My panic was subsiding, and I knew I was okay. The toothbrush I had previously had a death grip on was sitting next to the kitchen sink. It wasn't the toothbrush I had used to brush my teeth with regularly, but I recognized it. It was the toothbrush I kept underneath my sink to clean with. And for that, I used Comet, the powdered cleaner. This was more than just the unsettling feeling I experienced after the coffee and cream incident. This was chilling. My mouth was still burning, and I couldn't imagine what would have happened if I had swallowed accidentally. I threw up not too long after that, and that night, I hardly slept at all. I planned to call the research clinic as soon as they opened the following morning and have them remove the chip. But of course, the following morning when I called, the clinic was closed. Being unemployed can make you forget what day of the week it is, and that day, I found out, was Saturday. I didn't want to stay home, but I was too scared to leave. On that day, I watched TV. I didn't eat or even brush my teeth. On that day, I did not experience déjà vu. The following day, I couldn't bear to stay home. I was so afraid that I would be alone and something terrible would happen. These mundane tasks. I didn't want to do them. I didn't want to leave, but I forced myself to. I packed my things and went to the gym. I thought that maybe it would be harder to do something stupid while surrounded by so many people. My stomach growled on the drive there, but my mouth still burned. Parts, especially near my back molars, were completely raw. I packed my toothbrush, just in case, but I was too scared to brush my teeth again. I probably looked awful, but I didn't care. I hid inside of my baggy hoodie and baseball cap. Despite being hungry and in pain, the workout actually boosted my spirits quite a bit. I felt much safer being around people. And despite feeling terrified that the déjà vu would hit again, for some reason, I felt that I would rather it hit here. I worked my arms until they refused to move anymore, and then I went to the Stairmaster. I don't know how long I had been climbing the Stairmaster for before the rush hit me, but somehow it hit even stronger than it had the previous times. I felt with all my power that I had stepped on this machine in this exact way, precisely, at this exact same time. I had rewound my own timeline and was watching it play out. My vision blurred completely, but I continued to climb. I climbed up and up and up. The rush wore off, and I was left in a similar weird daze, but still, I kept climbing. Up and up and up. Only now the sound of my feet hitting the stairs sounded different. With every step I took, a metallic clang rang out. It was slippery. It was raining. I slipped and lost my balance. I was jolted out of my daze and instinctively grabbed at a metal post which connected the platform I was on to a handrail. My hands gripped the wet, slippery metal post with what little strength I had left, while my legs dangled in the air about 100 feet up. I was hanging off the side of a fire escape, in the rain, trying desperately not to fall to my death. My fingers turned white as they gripped around the post, but they were sliding off. I was going to fall. I had the most intense boost of adrenaline I've ever had in my life, and somehow managed to pull myself up. My fingers slipped off the pole just as I had pulled myself up. Then I scrambled forwards frantically and clung onto the side of the building. I sat crouched in that position for quite some time. I don't know how long. I never calmed down, but I eventually gained enough courage to begin the climb down. This building looked old and possibly abandoned, and I had no idea how I had gotten there. It sat on the stairs, slowly and carefully, lowering myself down one step at a time. I cried when my feet hit the pavement and I saw my car parked on the street. I didn't know where I was, but it felt unsafe. There were several abandoned-looking warehouse buildings. Bits of trash were being carried up by the wind and then beaten down by the rain, which was now coming down much more heavily than before. My phone was sitting on the passenger seat, although I don't know how it got there. Never in my right mind would I leave it there, especially in an area like this. But I picked it up, typed in directions, and drove straight home, shaking and crying the entire time. I don't know how, but I managed to sleep. I woke up early the next morning and stared at my phone until the second it hit 8 a.m., which was the time the research clinic opened. My desperation poured through into my voice as I begged the receptionist to let me come in today and get the chip removed. I explained that I was having very severe side effects and needed it removed immediately. She was hesitant but scheduled me for a 3 p.m. appointment. I drove there straight after the phone call and waited in my car for hours. I wasn't going to take any chances. I went in at 2:30. I was sick of waiting. I broke down as soon as I walked into the waiting room. I felt so relieved to be here and finally get this thing removed. One of the nurses put her arm around me and guided me back to one of the patient rooms. She took my vitals and waited with me until the main clinician arrived. I remember feeling so grateful that she waited with me. I didn't want to be alone. I explained everything to the clinician. He had the audacity to try to convince me to keep the chip in, but I wasn't going to budge, not after what happened. He explained that confusion was a common side effect, but I told him I didn't care. I told him his research wasn't as important as my life, and he reluctantly agreed to remove the chip. They prepared everything for the procedure, and I was placed in the exact same chair I sat in before when they made the insertion just last week. I sat there in that chair as the clinician spoke to me. He guided me through what he was doing. He told me he was going to make the incision, then said he was going to insert the metal rod used to remove the microchip. I sat as still as I could as the rod was slowly inserted into my head. I knew I had sat in that same chair before. I knew I had that same rod inserted into my head. But now, I felt certain that this familiar feeling wasn't from the first insertion. It was from right then. I had already experienced the removal of the chip, and I was now reliving it. I screamed so loud that it made my own ears hurt. And then, I went into a daze. Something painful struck my head. It struck again. This time, more intense than before. The pain became unbearable as it pounded into my head, over and over, again and again, in the same spot. My vision was completely blurred, and the smell of blood filled my nose. I snapped out of my daze and nearly vomited due to the pain. My eyes darted from side to side. I was afraid to move, but when I looked around, there was no one there. There were no lab assistants, no monitors, equipment, or tools. I was in a large, dark room. The walls had been torn apart, and water leaked through cracks in the ceiling. It was dark, damp, and smelled of mold. My head ached terribly, and I instinctively dropped what was in my hand to cover my head, which was bleeding all down my shirt. The clank of metal hit the concrete floor, and I looked down to see a long metal screwdriver covered in blood next to me. I was sitting in this old, run-down warehouse with blood pouring from my head and a screwdriver next to me. No one else was here, I had done this. I hardly remember leaving the warehouse. I had felt so paralyzed inside of there, but I eventually made it outside. My car was parked on the side of the road. It was parked in the same place as yesterday. When I had climbed the fire escape of the building that I now realize was the same building I had just been in. Again, my phone was on the passenger seat. I was bleeding profusely and not thinking clearly. I called an ambulance, but they never came. I called the clinic, but they didn't pick up. I called an ambulance again, but again, they never came. I sat in my car for what felt like hours before giving up and driving home. I'm sitting in bed now, on my phone. I was scrolling for hours and finally decided to write this post. Maybe tomorrow I'll try to go to a hospital, but I'm just not sure of anything right now. I really don't know if I trust anyone to remove the chip, considering what just happened. But I realize now one thing feels certain. As I type this out, it feels so clear. I've typed this very sentence before, just now. This too, I went back, and now I'm here again. This story, these words. I just wrote this. I just wrote this before. And now, just now, I'm writing this again. I'm certain. These words. I'm certain I've written them before.